So there's a lot of info in this section, so I guess just make our way
Grasslands.
just shout out observations as we go. So, yep, the grasslands are a vast expanse of windswept plains, rolling hills, and fertile river valleys, which stretch from the forest of Qohor to the Bone Mountains. Their breadth is over 700 leagues from east to west, and the grass there can grow as tall as a horse's head. Civilization was first born there during the Dawn Age when Westeros was nothing more than a howling wilderness, and also the first true towns arose on the northward banks of the Sarn River.
Just for reference, I was looking at my map here, and from the forest of Qohor to the Bone Mountains is about the same distance as it is from like the bottom of Dorne to Winterfell.
Wow.
So those are some big grasslands.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah, having
put
the
a
big
point of-
fold-out maps definitely helps with this with these sections. I was constantly consulting them.
Put a
That's
point
better.
of discussion on the grasslands, and this is something maybe you guys can just keep in the back of your mind as we go through, because there's obviously many different tribes and nations of peoples that lived in this area. But I'm curious as to what you guys think the steppe tribes, like the Dothraki, what their ultimate goal is. Do they want to just destroy everything? Because if they did, that would be bad for them, because they would have no one to sell slaves to. So it sounds like I'm curious as to why they just destroyed so many of these civilizations, because in our own world history, the steppe tribes relied on those civilizations to provide resources. So to utterly destroy it and raise the city was not a good idea.
Well, I think the Dothraki have practiced that quite a bit, because I mean they haven't, they've been content to let the free cities, just pay them off, and they haven't done anything to the cities of Slaver's Bay. And they seem to have not totally destroyed like Lazar either. They just raid it for slaves every occasionally. So
why were they so mean to the Sarnorians?
Because that was when they were united.
Well, yeah, I mean,
time.
this is a bit more closer to recent history, but it seems like they were going in every direction. The Sarnoris just didn't seem to be united enough to hold them back. But they went after the Carthi and the Qohor, and they tried to go east as well through the Bones, but the Sarnori were the only ones who buckled.
And Sarnori live on the grasslands, and the Dothraki have that religious thing, you will not plant crops on the grasslands, so yeah, they may have offended the religious things of the Dothraki.
I was interested hearing about all of the early civilizations as well. Apparently, the Fisher Queens were the first known rulers or civilization, and they ruled the lands adjoining the Silver Sea, which was a great inland sea at the heart of the grasslands. And they ruled on floating palaces that moved from shore to shore. I was wondering if there was like a Cranagman connection there. And they were sought out by smaller lords for their wisdom and counsel, and were seen as a center of learning and power. But outside their domain, men of the grasslands warred. And I was wondering if the Fisher Queens maybe had any relation to the Fish People, like as this sort of original ancient sort of god race.
I hope not.
No. Yeah.
Do we get the
I would think
I
they would
thought
be.
these weren't until like the Juggus 9, all of them, or did I miss that?
No, this is all
No,
grasslands.
Fisher Queens are here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it seems
I
like the
read this all in
grasslands
one
is sort of the
second.
cradle of civilization that spread
Right.
outwards.
Yeah, I thought the Fisher Queens is just sort of like this mystical pre-civilization people that sort of founded all civilizations, because the guy who was the founder of, or I'm sorry, he was like the Azor Ahai for this civilization, he was a child of a Fisher Queen. It was the Hazor Amai, yeah. And he was a
Really?
child of a Fisher Queen, and this is where like the Andals, the First Men, the Children of the Forest, the
Yeah.
Valyrians all theoretically came from. So you mentioned the Cranagman connection. There's a Skagosi connection with the unicorns, because there was a race of hairy men who rode unicorns, and the book mentions that they might have been the predecessors to the Ibbenese. So I thought about the Skagosi when I heard saw the unicorn thing.
Yeah, it seems like every race ever came from this point, and the Fisher Queens, like they were all sort of just tribes, just fighting against each other. But the Fisher Queens were just sort of in the center, not fighting, and I guess they were powerful enough and wise enough. Like they had a kind of wisdom that they were sought out and not attacked. But yeah, Yandel says the first men and the ancestors of the first men and the Andals likely lived in this region before migrating to the northwest. Yet tales of hairy, savage warriors who rode unicorns, and they might be the ancestors of the Ibbenese, which makes me think maybe the Skagosi have Ibbenese blood in them rather than First Men blood in them. Like they travelled westward across the Shivering Sea, rather than
No, I think
the arm of.
I think we would have noticed if the Skagosi were not regular humans and couldn't breed with other humans and blah blah blah.
We haven't seen.
Well, just maybe like a small percentage of them have
Yeah, like
Ibbenese
it's
blood.
a bit of blood in there, like
Right.
they've
It's
mixed
just
with
a
first
remnant
and
of
all
an
that.
ancient culture that influenced them a long time ago.
Like if the Ibbenese are Neanderthals, they say some like Neanderthals might have interbred with Homo sapiens at one point, and there's like a small amount of Neanderthal in some people.
Yeah, that's pretty solidly known. I think actually that's true.
Yeah, and I saw an article where it mentioned that East Asians might have interbred with Neanderthals much more than people from Europe, which is why there's much more homogeneity in the physical characteristics of people from East Asia as opposed to other parts of the world. And just to run down the rest of the ancient civilizations in the Grasslands, there was the Cimeri, which were the people who first invented armor. They were like hill tribesmen. Then there's a tribe called the Gips, Gipps. These were really tall people. And then there's also the Zokora, which was, it sounds like almost the predecessors to Valyrians because they had white hair, tan skin, and they rode war chariots. So I don't know if this is maybe the predecessor to Valyrians and also the Dothraki maybe. But there's also what, as we mentioned before, the Woodwalkers, who seem very Children of the Forest-like.
Yeah. And there was the Cathi in the south. They rose cities there in ancient times. There's also the lost city of Liber, which no one knows where it exists anymore, but legend has it that a spider goddess and a serpent god fought an endless war there. We don't know. I guess that's a metaphor for some battle that was fought there, maybe. And also in the east was the kingdom of the centaurs, apparently. And we hear about centaurs, but Archmaester Hagedorn suggests that they were probably only mounted warriors who had not yet learned how to tame and ride horses into battle. However, supposedly centaur skeletons show up from time to time.
Yeah, okay, but then again, it could be just like people putting together bones and saying, "Oh, see, centaur skeleton."
Yeah, like traveling freak shows and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. You know, the Aztecs thought that the conquistadors was, demigods, centaur demigods, when they first landed.
Yeah, the Scythians might have contributed to the whole centaur myth in Greek mythology.
Yeah.
And most of these people and cities are now gone. They were burned or buried or driven away or conquered and then assimilated by newer civilizations. And really only the city of Karth remains of that sort of bloodline. They fled south and pooled all of their strength and resources into a single city. And much of these people were conquered, including the Karthi, were conquered by the tall men of Sarnor, who were long of limb, brown of skin, and black of hair. They were warriors, sorcerers, and scholars who traced their descent back to the hero king Hazhor Amay, born of the last of the Fisher Queens, who took the wife of the daughters of the greatest lords and kings of the Gips, Cimeri, and the Zokora, binding all three peoples to his rule.
I love how he wore the pelt of the hairy man king.
Yeah,
that was one of my favorite details.
Yeah.
Do you guys think this is where the R'hllor religion came from because of Azor Ahai and the Amor Amai or whatever?
Yeah, I didn't make that
similar,
connection because it's spelled so differently, but it does sound similar. Yeah. Hazor Amai. Yeah, that's true.
Azor Ahai. Yeah.
A kind of great hero that sort of fights for all peoples. I was interested to learn about the Kingdom of Sarnor because I don't think this is ever mentioned in A Song of Ice and Fire novels, is it? It's only in here that we learn about them, and they were a proud and quarrelsome people, and they never united under a single ruler. However, they dominated the Grasslands prior to the Century of Blood. And Yandel says their gleaming cities were strewn about like jewels across a green velvet mantle, and the greatest of these cities was Sarnath of the Tall Towers, where the High King dwelt in the fabled Palace of 1,000 Rules, which Lomas Longstrider names as one of the other 9 wonders made by man. Hopefully we can get all 9 by the time the book's over. And a few other places is Sathar, the waterfall city at the juncture of 2 branches of the Sarn, Selosh, the city of scholars with its vast library and painted walls, and Mardosh, the city of soldiers, renowned as Mardosh the Unconquerable.
It also mentioned that the Sarnorians also participated in the wars between Old Gis and Valyria.
They did, yeah. They took sides with Valyria, and then in a later battle they took sides on both with the Gis, Skari, and the Valyrians. And that might have been one of the reasons why their city wasn't ruined by the Valyrians, unlike the Andals and the Rhoynar, because they helped them out at one point. And they are obviously a very formidable civilization in their own right. And it was called the Kingdom of Sarnor, but it often boasted several rival kings, Nevertheless, it was one of the first great civilizations of the world, along with Gis and Valeria. Sarnori ships sailed the entire world. They warred against the Giscari, the Quaithi, and the Horsemen of the Bones prior to the Dothraki coming. And the greatest of their warriors fought on chariots, with men and women fighting side by side.
Justin, can you talk a little bit about the description that you put in the outline about the correlations from real-world history of the chariot wars and how effective they were and stuff like that?
Yeah, I noticed the fact that this is the womb of the earth is similar to the idea of the Altai Mountains as the womb of nations, where like all these different horse archer nomads would come out of and settled all over the world, like from East Asia to West Europe. And that's sort of a direct correlation to our history.
Were war chariots historically they were less effective than like horse archers, correct?
Yeah, although they were actually invented by horse archers first.
Okay.
That was something I recently
So what was
learned.
the point of war chariots? Because obviously that was something that was prominent in Egyptian culture, and I just from the game Civilization. That's like their special military unit. But like, what was the whole point of the war chariots, and what how are they so? What made them a military advantage in the peak of their use?
Well, early horses supposedly weren't strong enough to bear people on their back, and so chariots were like a way around that. It was like an early version of the wagon.
This is so long ago, before people really even knew how to ride horses then, right?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Well, the other issue they had was like we figured out how to ride horses, but we didn't invent the stirrup until relatively late in the game. So if you don't have stirrups, it's kind of hard to fight from a horse's back because you have to hold on with your legs, and you don't have like that good base where you can, stand up and deliver a sword stroke or something like that.
Yeah,
like I want to say it was like post-Roman actually when the stirrup was invented.
Oh, yeah, it was like middle to late or middle Dark Ages, right? Like 8th, 9th century, where I think
Something
it originally
like that.
came over
Maybe
from,
a little bit
from
earlier.
Asia. Yeah.
But the Romans, during the Roman times, they had cavalry in their army.
They had cavalry, but they didn't have stirrups.
Right.
Okay.
And the Romans were fighting. I mean, they used chariots. Like the British, when they conquered Britain, when they came up against British chariots, they were like, oh, these guys with these things, and they were no match for them because they knew how to. Chariots couldn't go up against the legions and everything. But yeah, it was like when knew there was going to be a battle, they would have to like go out the day before and like clear all the rocks from the field where they think a chariot would have ran, because otherwise it would pop a wheel and it would just spill everybody. Like they really weren't that maneuverable, especially if you're not going up against other chariots.
I see. I wonder if maybe this was more of a technological thing of why they got destroyed by the Dothraki. I mean, it wasn't necessarily that the Dothraki are so fierce. It's just that maybe it's sort of inevitable if their best weapon was a chariot. Maybe it was sort of inevitable that someone was going to come by with a superior, mounted weapon and destroy them if that's all they had military-wise.
I think it was just the uniting factor. Like prior to the Century of Blood, the Horse Lords, they existed in the east on the steppes, I guess close to the Bone Mountains. They might have migrated there from beyond the Bones at one point, but they were fractured and they fought amongst themselves as very small tribes. But it was only when the Century of Blood started, after the fall of Valeria, that one Khal named Khal Mango, united all the Horse Lords into a single mighty Khalasar, and then decided we're going to take over the world, basically, and he almost did.
Who was the one that made the parallel between that historical battle between the Sarnorians and Dothraki with the Punic War with Hannibal?
Yeah. Oh, that was me. Yeah, I'll talk about the Romans and Hannibal now. But no, just the tactics of that battle the Battle of Cannae is like one of the worst defeat in Roman history, where basically the Carthaginians killed an entire 3 Roman armies, 100,000 men. But like the tactics of the Romans punched through the center. They thought that they were winning, and they actually ended up. Hannibal used his cavalry to close around the Romans on both sides. It's like the perfect double envelopment, and then it was a slaughterhouse for an entire day.
It may be me remembering it wrong, but from my in-depth historical knowledge, which is basically the History of Rome podcast, I thought the Battle of Cannae was different because the Romans punched through, and instead of the cavalry enveloping them, what they did is Hannibal had superior fighters on the edges, and all they were commanded to do was just hold their ground. So it created this sort of horseshoe the Romans created on their own, and then they got enveloped in that way.
Right, but Hannibal's cavalry actually chased off the Roman cavalry and then came back, and that was kind of like the lock that sealed the circle. As far as I don't know if Justin, you have any you can.
Yeah, they say his middle section was supposed to give way, It was originally in like a mighty duck pattern, like a chevron
Flying
shape or
V.
whatever you call it. Yeah, it was originally like that, and then it sort of gave way in the middle, and then it enveloped them.
But there was no faux retreat in that tactic, was there? Like there was here.
No.
Well, no, that it was
No, I
it was
don't think
part of
so,
the
I don't.
plan to give in the center. I don't know if it was a faux retreat.
Right,
Not like the
but they
Parthian
didn't
style.
faux retreat. Right. Okay. Because the faux retreat
Well-
that was common amongst other steppe tribes like the Mongolians and the Huns and stuff like that, right?
Well, that was a big
Yeah.
Parthian thing,
Yeah,
too.
the Mongols did that again
Right.
and again.
Basically, all
Yeah.
of the nomadic horse archers did that, from the Scythians on.
It's funny how usually there is a low-tech solution towards against a high-tech army.
We should say this is the battle known as the Field of Crows. This was like the final battle between the
Yeah.
Kingdom of Sarnor and the Dothraki, and it was probably one of the largest battles ever fought. Certainly one of the highest death counts. I think 100,000 Sarnori were encircled by the Dothraki and basically just eviscerated. But there was a lot of build up to that, obviously. Like the Dothraki came after the Sarnori fairly early because of their religious beliefs in the sacredness of the earth, I guess, and the idea that the earth is the mother and it's sinful to cut into its flesh with plows and spades. So they were definitely the prime target at the beginning. But the Sarnori never really took them seriously. They had their sort of eyes turned west for expansion, and because the Dothraki had been fighting amongst themselves so much, they never really took them seriously. And they even contracted them a few times, or tried to contract them as sellswords. But the Dothraki just took their money and then smashed their settlements. And they defeated a few cities in battle. City of Sarthor was defeated in battle, and the women and children were taken away as slaves off to this Giscari city of Hazhan Moro. And the one that held out the longest was the Mardosh the Unconquerable. They had to succumb to eating dogs and horses and rats during the siege, and finally their own dead, before they slayed their wives and children to spare them from slavery before riding out for one final battle. And the Dothraki, which seems like sort of a sign of respect compared to other cities, they named it Vaes Gorgoyi, the city of the blood charge, as opposed to the Ibbenese who fled before them, and they called it the city of cowards.
Yeah. Have you guys noticed some climate change parallels? Like you talked about the Silver Sea, which was like this vast inland ocean that sort of, maybe at more of an ice age time at the Planetos, was just a giant ocean, but now because of global warming, it's more like it sort of devolved into just inland lakes.
Yeah.
Which the closest analogy in my mind would probably be the Great Lakes of North America. But this might actually, it just made me think of the fact that George does a beautiful job of weaving in things like global climate change and how that affected civilization over time, and how it can make an area that historically seemed like like more of a maritime environment or more of a grassland environment, and then in modern times it's more of like a desert.
Yeah, and there were other civilizations that also came under the Dothraki hammer, like the Ibbenese city of the north, the Cathi cities to the south.
Kingdom of Omber. It's like very small, not mentioned often.
Omber? Oh, I didn't read that one. There's also a Valerian colony called Assaria, which is called the Lost Free City. Also fell to the Dothraki during the Century of Blood. And they tried to go even further west, and they attacked Qohor, but the Unsullied threw them off, which we know from Book 3. And they also tried to go east as well, but they couldn't make their way past the Bone Mountains because there's only 3 very narrow corridors to the east, and they're guarded by the female warriors known as the
Patrimony of Harkoon.
Harkoon, that's it. Yeah, that's cool.
Is there a reason why Karth was able to survive the Dothraki and the other Kathi cities didn't?
It's got the 7-walled city, and there seems to be strategically placed to repel, they can't be besieged by the Dothraki, really.
And it was a specific decision to abandon all the cities and muster their forces. So rather than being divided and having to defend a bunch of cities, they bolstered their strength and created this one big city. And they also created a navy to sort of gain strength over the Jade Sea. And also the Dothraki were busy with the Sarnori at this point, so they had time to fortify themselves, and it worked out.
And the desert seemed to come up at just the right time, so that the Dothraki can no longer cross the Red Waste.
Yeah. Speaking of climate change, did any of you guys get a chance to look at that Preston Jacobs video I posted on the Red Waste?
Oh, to do with Karth and all that stuff?
Yeah.
I disdainfully closed it after about 5 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty, I started off interesting, but he makes a pretty fundamental error in assuming that bones disintegrate after less than 100 years or something. Apparently, in our arid climates, they can last much longer, because he was assuming that a lot of these Carthy cities, like the City of Bones that Danny stumbles across, may have been inhabited.
Are you saying Princeton Jacobs made a false assumption and then built something on top?
It's madness, I know. But the one interesting thing I thought he made was that it seems like there's been some climate change with the red waste.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that, and I think I just recently reread this chapter is in Clash of Kings when Dany and the remnants of her Khalasar get to Vaes Dothrak. It just seems really strange because it doesn't seem like a traditional city that was destroyed by war or plundering. It seems like everything was still pretty intact and all the fruit trees were still there and stuff. And so it was kind of mysterious, like what it was that killed all these people and all these piles of skulls everywhere and bones but one of her blood riders found a fire opal, which was like a jewelry, which indicated that this wasn't a town that was raided because there were still valuables left behind. So it sort of seems like more of a natural cause, like a natural disaster or a dragon or something.
Yeah, that's what he poses. We assume it's been attacked by the Dothraki, but it could have just died of starvation or famine or climate change. Like it used to be a more fertile land, because we do see images on the walls of Karth that do look very fertile and full of animals like wolves that are obviously all gone. So that might have been the cause of it rather than a sack.
It was nettles.
It could have been nettles, yeah. We see it. We find a dragon skeleton, so obviously nettles. Yeah, I just thought it was interesting. But yeah, it's cool. Yeah, and at the end we learn a bit about the only permanent settlement of the Dothraki is Vaes Dothrak, which is not a true city with walls or streets, but it is a gathering point for the Dothraki. It lies beneath the Mother of Mountains. It's ruled over by the Crones, who were widows of former Khals who have died, and it's believed to be the birthplace of their race, as you say, called the Womb of the World. And traders gather there from all around the world, and it is a holy place where shedding blood is forbidden.
So Vaes Dothrak is supposed to be kind of like a analogy to Karakorum, right? Kind of, sort of?
I don't know what that
is.
And we all know what Karakorum is. Augustine, why don't you...
Just for the people listening that don't know.
Yeah, just explain
I'm not a historical expert, but from what I saw from the Marco Polo series, Karakorum is the capital of Mongolia, and it was the capital of pretty much the Mongolian tribe, which was a well-known, powerful horse tribe civilization that dominated people. And as a capital city, it wasn't all that fancy like Rome or some of the cities in China or anything like that, but it was sort of in the middle of the Mongolian Empire and just served as that home base area for the culture, but it really wasn't all that much to it as far as infrastructure.
Well, for the longest time, I mean, the Mongols kept their... Yeah, like they didn't believe in building cities, so they kept just having fancier and fancier tents. And that was like what they would live in, even when it was Kublai Khan, was like probably the richest guy in the world at that point. And he was still living in a tent, just an awesome tent.
Linking it to the events of the novel, do you think maybe this is the place where Dany might have to return to? To go forward, you have to go back?
Yes, because one of her visions in House of the Undying has all the crones getting out of the lake and kneeling to her, and that hasn't happened yet.
And like something about the mountain blowing in the breeze, like leaves or something.
I think she's definitely got to go back there. Just getting the, Khal Pono, or the one that she just found at the end of book 5, like that's not going to be enough if she's going to do her thing. She's got to get everybody, and it makes sense if she has to go back to Vaes Dothrak to make that happen.
Because we do in fact hear, because I mean the prophecy of the stallion that mounts the world is it seems to almost stem from this chapter, because we hear about this great Khal who created a single Khal out of all the Dothraki, and it's fractured and it's never been reformed since. So maybe Dany could do that with Drogon. It could be like the stallion that mounts the world or something. Like
and it says they're waiting for another Khal who will once again take them and unite them.
Yeah, if she could get the crones to kneel to her in Vaes Dothrak, she could maybe unite all the Dothraki to that point and then use it maybe, I don't know, to do what? Defeat the Volantines on land?
To fuck Essos up.
Yeah. Have free reign. But
does anyone on this panel that knows a lot about history, is there any real world analogy to the Doge Colleen?
Not in that scale, I think. Because there is like matriarchal societies where the wisest old woman basically rules the tribe, but not in the hundreds of thousands of people that
Isn't this the
So
way
not in this-
something like the Vikings did too? Like if say a Viking king was killed, his wife and family weren't necessarily killed. They were just sort of reintegrated into society as like the former first family, right? Kind of thing, or were they?
Is that based off purely
Sometimes.
the TV show Vikings? 'Cause that's
Yes. That's where all my knowledge comes from.
No, it was.
Siggy and everybody.
Yeah, it went both ways. Sometimes you did have the wife being killed and buried with them, and sometimes not. It really depended on the situation and how fanatical people were at the time. So you can't take a broad stroke on that one. But yeah, women had better rights for inheriting their husbands, or at least they could live in their husband's house at least until their son or somebody grew up, or they could take a new husband if they wanted, usually.
One of the questions on the doc was what made the horse people so badass and dominant in the grassland area of A Song of Ice and Fire, and also in real world history. I mean, we sort of touched on it, but any more thoughts on that?
Horses are badass.
Well,
Yeah, I mean,
people
all
had
the-
horses. It's not like they
But,
were
like-
unique in that they had horses and other people didn't. But I think in this case, and I think I was the one that put some of these down, is especially as far as our own real world history, like the horses from the steppe tribes people were faster and stronger, I think, than the traditional civilized people's horses, and they also had a much closer relationship. So one given Mongolian warrior, for example, had several mounts that he would bring with him into battle, and the horses would just follow him along. They wouldn't need reins or anything like that because the horses are so used to their people, and they would follow them everywhere like dogs kind of would now. That anytime they lost a mount, they would have a secondary mount right there with them.
Well, it wasn't
so
just that they would lose a mount; they would switch it. They would keep switching off so they could ride faster.
Okay.
Jumping from horse to horse. All right, now
Yeah,
on the fast
yeah.
horse.
They also lived off of them too. They used them for mare's milk, and if they needed like more carbohydrates or something, they would make a cut in the horse's shoulder, and they would collect it into a cup and drink it, or mix it with kumis or arag or whatever it's called, fermented mare's milk, so they could live off of
Ew.
these horses without a baggage train carrying a bunch of water and food.
It really makes me wonder how these were the only Asians that weren't lactose intolerant, because they obviously weren't. So I don't know how.
They're also
No,
very battle hardened. They're almost like raised from birth to lust after battle, and that's all they know their entire life. They're almost like Spartans or something, where they'll fight to the death. Like there's no hesitation in killing your enemy. Like I think that's part of it. Like their enemies almost have too much to lose, so they'll try and pay them off or try and work out some kind of deal. But that's all they live for, the Dothraki, to conquer and defeat.
Like when they smash up against the kingdom of Sarnor, that really is like when the Mongols sent their scouting party of 20,000 men into Russia and Hungary, and they just completely destroyed these civilized mounted knights and who were used to civilized warfare. They didn't come up against heavy cavalry with archers, and they just destroyed them to the man. That's the biggest time period for me was when they brushed up against Europe. It was these two cultures clashing, not just armies clashing, and that was they completely killed hundreds of thousands of men. Like Europe had never had those kind of casualties before, up from ancient times ever.
It's definitely tactics is a huge thing with them. They have really advanced military tactics. Their military is really well organized. Yeah, and that whole feigned flight maneuver, it works really well against pretty much any army.
They shot arrows further and faster than what civilized sort of armies, like Roman armies, really thought arrows could travel. So these arrows were piercing their shields and their armor in ways that they thought just wasn't possible before.
It's just not very normal to have a bow that could shoot that powerful on a horseback. You wouldn't be able to draw it that far back. You need to have special riding bows like the Japanese had and the Mongols had to actually do some real damage against knights and stuff like that. So,
yeah, their fighting style is very flexible and agile, hard to sort of predict and fight against. And I think the fact that they're nomadic also makes it hard to threaten them. Like there's no sort of base or home that you can attack or besiege or whatever. You're literally just facing the army itself, as opposed to your, I guess, assets. They can attack your villages, your homes, your whatever.
if they ever got outnumbered or felt like they were in trouble, all they had to do was run away. They never had to defend a certain geographic location per se.
And they almost set the stakes themselves. They can draw you out by attacking places that are vulnerable, like your villages. They provoke you into the field on their terms.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting as well to think about it in terms that the European fighting style at that point is actually farther from our modern combat tactics than the Mongols' fighting tactics, combat tactics were. You see
Yeah.
the whole, ranged combat, hit and run styles, and take out small targets to weaken the opponent and everything like that. That's much more like what we do now, what a lot of armies do now. So that's kind of interesting that we as Europeans have in a long time seen like mounted knights to be like the best of the best, like the modern tanks, but the medieval
Well, I mean,
tanks.
that was more ideology than reality, though. If you had,
exactly.
if you had good disciplined infantry, you could beat knights every time, just like the Scots did and the Flemish did, and people like that.
Yeah, and I know. That's just what I'm saying. I'm saying it's sort of like a spin that's been put on knights to make them actually cooler than they actually are, because the tactics wouldn't work in modern age at least.
And there's a lot of geographic pinches of salt that you have to take, because all the advantages that the Sept tribes people like the Mongolians or the Dothraki in this case have is really attuned for their environment, which is more of a grassland environment. You take that same army, they're gonna have a hard time conquering Switzerland, or a really mountainous area where horses can't go. Because good luck, bro. Let's see how well those archers penetrate, kingdoms on top of giant mountains. So I'd like to see how the Dothraki do in the Vale of Arran, to be honest with you, because I don't see how they in any way make it to the Eyrie. Like, good luck getting past the Bloody Gate.
Yeah, the real nomadic horse archers had trouble in a few places, like in India. I think they had a lot of trouble there, raising their crops and everything. I think that's one of the reasons why they liked tearing down cities and stuff, to turn things back into like vast grasslands where their way of life could be sustained.
Okay. Do we want to move on to the Shivering Sea? Any more to say on the grasslands?
Nah.
I just had a question I wanted to ask, because this region, like, we hear very early on in like book 2 when Danny's going to Karth, but in my head I had to build this because there was no official world map, when I was reading the second book, and in my head I have what I thought the world was, from 6-7 years ago, and now seeing it, like, because we didn't get this until we got the maps of Ice and Fire a couple years ago, and I see the map, but in my head it's like I have these two, because the world is much bigger than I thought it was, and I just don't know, did anyone else have to like reconcile what they thought in their heads, and did that take away from it, or does that make sense? Because I have these like two battling versions of the worlds in my head, and it doesn't really matter because it's all made up, but I can't reconcile parts of it.
Well, I started with a show.
I thought it was basically cooler, when I saw the map, and I was like, oh wow, Karth is a long way from Slaver's Bay, because I had originally imagined that they were closer together, so I was, but I mean, I guess I thought it was cooler than the way I was imagining it.
There's also a lot of detail that Martin puts into the Song of Ice and Fire story proper that, frankly, like, you don't really necessarily need to understand the story. But once you go back, like, after reading the Worlds of Ice and Fire, I'm actually on my own personal reread right now, and there's a whole lot that I'm finding where he's making all these references to the Sarnor, maybe not the Sarnorians, but other like SOC civilizations, and I just never noticed them before because I frankly just didn't understand it, so I just skipped right over it.
Yeah,
but I'm looking at it now, and it's a much richer picture than I had initially thought.
Yeah, like even in Game of Thrones, when Dany's Khalisar is making her way to Vaes Dothrak, they go through the hills of Norvos and the forest of Qohor with all these like magical animals sort of flittering through the trees, and you see the villagers poking their heads out from behind sort of hut windows and things like that. It's only a few paragraphs, but it's even back then this world was sort of forming in his mind.
That's like one of the things that Martin is really, really good at, is sort of, just throwing details like that in there, and, whether he really has it all worked out or anything or not, it sounds like he does, and it just adds so much depth to the world, just like, just like you're saying, Augustine.
It's just a little seed that he grows.
Before we get to the Shivering Sea, there's actually one thing I want to talk about is these fortress cities, Bayashabad, Samiriana, and Kaya-Nayana.
Are these the bones on the bones?
Yeah, they're in the bones.
Well, we can do those next segment.
They're beyond the bones.
Yeah, that's...
Oh, I'm sorry. Never mind. Okay.
I mean, they are mentioned in this because the Dothraki have dealings with them, but their whole section is beyond.
Oh, right. Okay, never mind. So we'll get that later.
We can talk about rubies and breasts later.
Yeah, we'll get to them. Don't worry.
Breath.
We got to get to fish people with pointed teeth. So
We do. So much to get to.